tonight we have 3 members of our VU STH community. Read the names, and I invite you to come to the table here. First, we will have a response by Dr. Cho Hee An. She's a clinical assistant professor of practical theology and the director of the Anna Howe Shaw Center. Her areas of teaching and research interests are pastoral theology, leadership, and postcolonial studies. Her recent books are Postcolonial Self in 2015 and A Postcolonial Leadership in 2020, and forthcoming book in 2022, A Postcolonial Relationship Challenges of Asian Immigrants as the Third Other. Then we'll have Mr. Jara Ko. Jara is a first-year PhD student at the Boston University School of Theology. He was born and raised in Singapore and moved to the United States in 2014, which began the process of making him a person of color. This is an interesting shift for many of us that come from different countries and an Asian. The process remains for him a site for struggle and study. And then we'll have Dr. Mini Wariboko, is the Walter G. Mulder Professor of Social Ethics here at the School of Theology, a lively disciplinary thinker. He loves to unfold, refold, enfold, and energize past and present ideas and hopes in relation to the possibilities of human flourishing. Those of you in his classes can see this, how this develops. He is the author of 24 monographs, co-editor of 6 volumes, and multiple journal articles and book chapters. The 5 pillars of his scholarship are economic ethics, Christian social ethics, African social traditions, political theology, Pentecostal studies, and philosophical theology. In 2020, a group of scholars from multi-continents honored Dr. Wariboko with a book titled The Philosophy of Nimi Wariboko, Social Ethics, Economy, and Religion, and an international conference on ideas, at an international conference of ideas. So welcome the 3
Okay, so when I heard about the Atlanta shooting and had my personal anti-Asian violence incident, I contacted Dr. Kwok. She told me to do 2 things: take care of myself and be in solidarity with others. And I have witnessed how she organizes many workshops, protests, and classes to teach about anti-Asian violence and racism, and demonstrates strong solidarity with not only Asian American individuals and communities, but also Black, Latinx, and transnational groups beyond the theological circles. Her activist work and academic analysis of post-colonial theology has made a profound impact, shaping Asian American theological thoughts and actions. Her emphasis of solidarity has demanded many Asian American groups to be in solidarity with one another beyond their ethnic circles. As she nurtures and mentors our younger generations, she founded the Pacific, Asian, and North American Women in Theology and Ministry Conference in collaborative leadership with other Asian leaders. This place has been the most empowering and nurturing space for Asian and Asian American women for the last 36 years. When I met Rita Nakashima Brock at this conference this year and expressed deep despair, she offered a different perspective. She said she felt actually more hopeful because anti-Asian violence was finally named in public, not dismissed as a personal individual problem. As Dr. Kwok just illustrated in this lecture, many Asian and Asian American theologians have tried to name the challenges of Asian American people in public and provide the way to deconstruct colonial white power and system from the Asian American experiences, and to reconstruct interstitial integrity and hybrid culture as our authentic self. Especially as she emphasized, solidarity with other ethnic groups is the most important priority that many Asian American leaders address, and I could not agree more. However, I observe the passivity or lack of solidarity among our Asian American immigrants. Why? One of the answers that I named here is the positionality of Asian immigrants as the third other. As Dr. Kwok argues for the transnational and multicultural origins and genealogies as the foundation of political theology, these transnational and multicultural origins and genealogies are the undeniable existence of who Asian immigrants are. When this undeniable existence intersects with the US socio-political binary structure, it creates another dimension of existence, the third other. The current construction of racial-ethnic relation is heavily built on the foundation of a black-white binary relationship, which is often thrown into the talk of white-black racism. Talking about racism among other racial groups is often misunderstood as a tool to dismiss the importance of black-white racism, especially as a tool to weaken the importance of African Americans' suffering. Adding more racial problems that various groups bring to the table is seen as an act of jeopardizing and distracting from the weight of black and white racial conversations. In a similar manner, when people talk about the immigrant issues, they are mainly focused on the discussion of native alien divides, especially between Latinx aliens and white natives. Colonial and post-colonial power and its relationship among various ethnic groups hardly enters into the discussion of immigrant issues. Perceiving immigrant issue as either a competition or a survival necessity among people from undeveloped and or developing countries, the native alien divide easily erases the presence of each ethnic group in the United States and dismiss their different ways of experiencing suffering as an unfortunate alien incident. The positionality of Asian immigrants lies in these intersections. They are neither completely black nor white. They are neither completely aliens nor natives. They are neither completely minorities nor non-minorities. They are never recognized as the complete other. Rather, they are treated as the invisible other who exists but is never identified as the other at the opposite end. They are the imperfect other. It is as much a politically repressive other as it is an economic indispensable other, but not the other whose presence requires absolute political correctness and economic oppression. Their otherness is not treated as the other in binary paradigms. Existence of their otherness is denied. Binary paradigms dismiss their otherness as non-otherness because their otherness is positioned as the middle in binary relations and the third place in multi-relations. So I call it the third other. Because of this third otherness, their solidarity with the other is much more complicated and harder to develop. However, because we have someone like Dr. Kwok, Rita Nakashima-Brock, and many Asian leaders, this third otherness has been transformed into a position of solidarity, into a position of solidarity and connectedness. I am in absolute agreement with Dr. Kwok that yes, we need to challenge the empire with our transnational, interreligious, and intersectional ways of being and doing theology to build solidarity across the national, racial, geographical, and the cultural boundaries for our common future. Thank you.
Dr. Kwok, I want to thank you especially for opening up Asia-Pacific political theology to multiple approaches across space and time, and your pairing of that openness with the urgency demanded by emergent Asian issues. In my response, I would like to focus in particular on the dimension of danger within this urgent openness and within these issues. The possibility of a counter-genealogy for political theology that can be traced to a Chinese revolutionary socialist instead of a German fascist is to me very generative. So I want to inquire into this possibility, hopefully but carefully, against the contemporary resurrection of Carl Schmitt in Chinese political theory by scholars like Liu Xiaofeng and Chen Duanhong. It seems that as soon as we've thrown Carl out the front door, he has slipped in the back. Still sprightly for a 131-year-old, his corpus readily takes to an application of yellowface and translation into new languages with which to declare an emergency state of exception that empowers the state to generate new laws, violate the old, or suspend them altogether. As a creature more of Sino-American Empire than Chinese or American Empire alone, I believe we can hear American-accented ventriloquy coming from the reanimated Schmidt too, fluently adopting the language of the anti-Asian hate crime wave. The historical production of hate crime law and crime wave narratives has been dissected by sociologist Tamara K. Nopper with a precision and subtlety that my response today cannot contain. But three dangers emerge from her work that I think press intimately upon Asia-Pacific political theology. First, to mobilize the emergency of the hate crime wave for the sake of urgently producing hate crime law as a defense against anti-Asian violence is to understand the state as a reliable defense against that violence, and by extension, to understand that the state is not itself the primary perpetrator of anti-Asian violence. This speaks most of all of what we define as anti-Asian violence in the first place. Second, such a mobilization understands Asian Americans as more vulnerable to the violence of the criminalized than vulnerable to the violence of criminalization. Third, such mobilization rehabilitates a criminal justice system in an extreme crisis of legitimacy, reaffirming it and bolstering its funding precisely in the wake of the work of the George Floyd Rebellion. A meaning-laden statement in itself on the relationship between Asianness and blackness. To use mutated Schmittian terms, this mobilization rests then upon an understanding of the sovereignty of some Asians to declare an emergency that suspends the constitution of other Asians as Asians. Sex workers, unhoused people, gangbangers, trans people, drug dealers, undocumented people. That is to say, those Asians who cannot risk the dangers of turning to the police, as well as those Asians who will only ever experience hate crime law from its business end, as it has historically been deployed, when a judge compounds their existing sentence for other already criminalized acts. It is, then, another means of producing what Nopper calls safe Asian Americans, a carceral iteration of the moral minority myth, in the argument over what Asian means in relation to the state and violence, and who is thereby truly Asian American. An argument that, as Dr. Kwok has pointed out, began in opposition to Orientalization, but does not ever conclude itself. I'm excited by the many liberatory dimensions suggested by political theologies, diverse origins, and multicultural genealogies. But I want to be careful not to take diversity, multiculturalism, or the Asian prefix as guarantees for safety. I wonder, therefore, how to think of the liberatory elements that you highlight, Dr. Kwok, alongside the Schmittian logics that are also accommodated by Asia-Pacific and political theology alike. I find myself hesitating at the sharp contrast you draw between the contexts of a post-colonial and de-imperial Asia-Pacific and a growing populist and nationalistic North Atlantic. As someone regularly conflicted by my designation and work under the banners of Asian and theology, and conflicted by my relationships to others under those same designations, I would like to sincerely ask you some questions that are as personal as they are academic for me, Dr. Kwok. What are we to make of the resurgence of Carl Schmitt in China? What can we make of Asia-Pacific political theology, with Wu Yaozong in its left hand and the Schmittians in its right? Why should those of us called Asian keep fighting to breathe in the bones of political theology? Why also should we persist as Asian and keep contesting its meaning? And with all the myriad possibilities before us as Asian theologians, how do we decide when to stay and fight, when to flee to safety, and when to risk building something new, something dangerous? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kwok's lecture is like a river moving in two distinct but related courses. There is an evocative pathway hidden below the surface that calls us to rethink our understanding of politics or the political. This concealed underground course manifests into an open sea of fluid rationality, The two streams of our lecture are sourced from one fountain, from the excess weight of imposed social suffering endured by Asian Americans. From the plight of their suffering, her notion of the theological was born. Her interpretation of the theological and the political are woven together in our lecture by the brilliance, cadence, and the pathos of her reasoning. Dr. Kwok began a thought-provoking lecture by questioning the restricted, Eurocentric constitutionalization of political theology. Political theologians in this country often limit the analysis of political spaces to countries in the West or to issues pertaining to people of European descent. European and Euro-American theologians also shy away from what she calls transnational and multicultural origins and genealogies of political theology. We can surmise that their political theology is almost always about Carl Smith, sovereignty, state, order, religious legitimization of authority or power. In response to these salient shortcomings, Kwok wants to tilt political theology in a different direction. If I read that correctly, she wants the point of departure of political theology to be the real-life suffering of people, the human condition of the oppressed and the marginalized in our society, and not about sovereignty, state, or government. Her political theology is about engaging with social conditions, and not about spinning our intellectual wheels over reified notions such as sovereignty, nation, people, race, and so on. Therefore, it is not an accident when she began her talk by focusing on the murder of 8 people, including 6 Asian American women, on March 16, 2021. It is also no accident that she informed us that whilst Carl Smith was writing his hugely influential political theology, students in Beijing took to the streets to protest the transfer to Japan of Germans' right over Chinese Shandong Peninsula at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. She went on to demonstrate how the Chinese thinker Wu Zhendong put the emphasis of his theology on social revolution. He called for social revolution as a way of addressing the plight of his people subjected to Western imperialism and capitalist exploitation. Her comment on Smith and Zhendong points us to 2 other orientations of her political theology. First, she does not celebrate political order at the expense of liberation of the oppressed. Her alignment with Zhendong's thought should inform us that she does not separate political theology from economic theology. Second, she approaches the study of the theological, the political, and the economical through a transdisciplinary, intersectional, and transnational methodology. We can draw 4 significant hermeneutic keys from Kwok's lecture. First, for her, social condition is the preferred point of departure for political theological analysis. In other words, the new political theology she's calling for must begin from the situation. Her political theology demands a diagnosis of the socio-political economic situation of the community as its point of departure. Paul Tillich argued that, and I quote, that the situation cannot be neglected in theology without dangerous consequences. Only a courageous participation in the situation, that is in all the various cultural forms which express modern man's interpretation of his existence, end of quote, can uncover the possibilities of freedom and human flourishing in any given political period. The urgent task before Asian American theologians and any other political theologian for that matter today is to identify the situation begging for radical transformation in the name of justice and human flourishing for all. Second, the focus of political theology should not be confined to maintaining oppressive political systems. Political theology must be open to political praxis and change, encourage citizens to engage in emancipatory politics to liberate their communities from the clutches of rapacious hegemonic powers. In this regard, permit me to mention one neglected area in our lecture. Our analytical presence did not cover political disorder. We need the theology of political disorder to decenter and destabilize the excessive focus of Western political theology on order. Political theologians must ask how disorder disrupts order. How do people who live in perpetual disorder survive? Indeed, theology must engage the real of eruptions and disruptions that are part of every order. From the disorders that sustains others, and from places and people who have only perpetual disorder, like in Africa, ruptures and fragility to contend with 24/7 as their form of common life. Third, our analysis suggests that political theology and economic theology are always co-implicated in any serious discourse of contemporary human condition. But in our lecture, and I'd like to push her a bit, she did not really open up political theology to economic theology, so they can both ask for, create, and sustain alternative possibilities that support human flourishing. I suggest that we think political theology together with and within economic theology in an apparatus of thought that can illustrate how life hangs together. In the late capitalism of Marudin global capital, production, and distribution, the political is always sliding into the economical, if not always already ensconced there. Finally, Kwok ascends transdisciplinary and boundary-breaking method of study. This method carries the force of ethical urgency to not only bear witness to human suffering, but also resist the forces thwarting possibilities for human flourishing and to empower social groups struggling to hold on to their interstitial integrity. Let us now turn to the hidden stream. I told you there's two streams. Let us turn to the hidden stream, the underground well that swells our thinking about political theology. It is about the meaning of politics. That is the subtext of it. What is the meaning of politics? The sad story she narrated about Asian American plight in this country should not just to deeply question our understanding of politics. Politics is supposed to be the immune system of the community against lack of being with, expropriation, dangerous contagion of social relations. Politics immunizes the community against existential lack to support the being that is at stake in how our lives hang together, the being of our coexistence that is the being of our existence that is always a coexistence. Politics as immunization is about working out the good and the fitting nomos to share a polities abundant being with and material groups in a way that can promote social flourishing, human flourishing for all. But in today's America, politics as an immune system that attacks its own body. This is the tragic subtext of our lecture. Thus, for Kwok, political theology must be a work of healing the diseased immune system of our society. In conclusion, in the preceding discourse, I attempted to unveil the deep structures of political theology. This exercise obviously has its own shortcomings. For instance, some of you or some critics may accuse me of sculpting the Mount Rushmore of our political theology from the boulder of a single lecture. Forgive me, I sensed that something was at stake in our talk. There was a lesson to be learned and an enlightenment of our ethical sensibility to be gained. While listening to our lecture, I sensed that Dr. Kwok wanted to demolish the fortress of Eurocentric political theology by force of arms. This brings me to what Martin Heidegger once said about the philosophy of John Victor and Hegel. In their attempts to attack the fortress built by Immanuel Kant on the question of community. And I quote Heidegger here, he said, that's philosophy of Hegel and Victor said, this philosophy leaps over Kant with all due respect, but did not overcome him. This could not be done if for no other reason, because his essential foundation was not attacked, but only abandoned. It was not even abandoned, because it was never taken. It was only skidded. Kant's work remained like an unconquered fortress behind a new front. End of quote. In Kwok's lecture today, I said that she was not leaping over, but wanting to overcome Western political theology in the name of post-colonial theory. She attacked the essential foundation of European, Euro-American political theology. Asian American theology will not allow itself to just be a new front behind which stands the unconquered fortress of imperial and dominating European and Euro-American theology. In the name of all the oppressed and marginalized peoples here in the United States and the rest of the world, she had fired a powerful salvo to enter by force the fortress of political theology, built, maintained, and guarded by the hegemonic thought system in our universities. Her goal was to open up the fortress to all children of God. Finally, it was not only Heidegger that trained my sights on the ultimate goal of Kwok's lecture. The words of Jesus Christ in Matthew 3:27 attuned my senses to the strength of our scholarly struggle. In Mark 3:27, he said, in fact, no one can enter a strong man's house without first tying him up. Then he can plunder the strong man's house. Dr. Kwok's strong intellect against the strong man of political theology has been on display here today. Thank you for your brilliant lecture.